They mocked the quiet waitress with a messy bun, oversized suit, and worn romance novels. She poured coffee, drove a Mafia boss's car, and never complained when hardened gangsters laughed behind her back. Then, one rainy night, an ambush erased every armed man protecting the city's most feared crime lord. In less than a minute, the timid driver became something else entirely. A ghost moving through bullets, leaving elite mercenaries dead before they understood they were fighting back. Donatello Rossi thought he'd hired a bodyguard. He had actually hired the deadliest assassin ever to disappear, because all she wanted was a quiet life. If you like this kind of story, please like and subscribe. Let's dive into the story. The Rossi Syndicate had ruled the city's underworld for 3 generations, built on a foundation of fierce loyalty and brutal efficiency. Now, that foundation was cracking. The assassinations were too clean, too precise, and too knowledgeable of the family's inner workings. There was a rat in Donatello's house. He glanced over his shoulder. 10 men stood behind him, clad in black, their heads bowed in mourning. Some were lieutenants, some were muscle. Donatello looked at their faces and realized with a sickening twist in his gut that he couldn't trust a single one of them. The private security contractors he had briefly hired were no better. They were easily bought by the rival Moretti cartel. "We need to move, boss," Silvio muttered. Silvio was Donatello's chief enforcer, a hulking, scarred brute whose loyalty was theoretically unquestionable, though Donatello was past believing in theories. Being out in the open like this, it's a bad play. "I decide what's a bad play, Silvio," Donatello replied, his voice a low rasp. But he turned away from the grave anyway. Later that evening, exhausted and paranoid, Donatello ordered his driver to pull over in a run-down, neon-lit district on the edge of the city. He needed a moment to breathe, away from the gilded cage of his estate. He stepped into a dingy, late-night diner that smelled of burnt coffee and bleach. 2 bodyguards trailed him, standing awkwardly by the door. Donatello sat in a booth, staring blankly at a laminated menu. That was when the trouble started. A massive, heavily tattooed man, drunk and belligerent, began harassing a waitress 2 booths down. The man was shouting, slamming his massive fists on the Formica table, demanding a refund for a meal he had already eaten. "Hey," Donatello muttered to his guards. "Handle that." Before his men could take a single step forward, the situation resolved itself. The waitress, a slender woman in a faded pink uniform, her dark hair tied up in a messy bun secured with a pencil, sighed softly. She didn't look afraid. She looked profoundly annoyed. As the drunk lunged forward to grab her collar, she shifted her weight. It happened so fast Donatello almost missed it. She didn't throw a punch. She simply stepped inside the man's guard, seized his extended wrist, pivoted, and applied a joint lock that defied the laws of physics. With a sharp, agonizing crack, the massive man dropped to his knees, screaming in pain. She hadn't spilled a drop of the lukewarm coffee in her other hand. "Your total is $12.50, the waitress said, her voice entirely flat. "Leave a tip, or I break the elbow." The man fumbled frantically with his good hand, threw a crumpled $20 bill on the table, and scrambled out the door, nursing his twisted arm. The waitress sighed again, picked up the 20, and wiped down the table. Donatello sat frozen. He had spent his life around violence. He knew the difference between a lucky barroom brawl and trained, mechanical precision. That woman hadn't just defended herself. She had dismantled a threat with absolute, algorithmic efficiency. He stood up, waving his guards back, and approached her. "What's your name?" Donatello asked. "Lena," she said without looking up, tossing a dirty rag into a bin. "Where did you learn to do that, Lena?" "I grew up with older brothers," she lied, perfectly deadpan. She looked up at him, taking in his $3,000 suit, his gold watch, and the 2 armed men at the door. "You want more coffee or what?" "I want to hire you," Donatello said. "I need a shadow. Someone to stand behind me, drive my car, and watch my back. I will pay you triple whatever you make here in a year, and I'll pay it in cash." Lena stared at him. Her eyes were strange, pale gray, completely devoid of emotion. "I don't know who you are, mister, but I pour coffee. I'm not a bodyguard." "I don't need a bodyguard right now," Donatello said quietly, the desperation leaking into his voice. I need a blank slate. Someone whose loyalties I don't have to question, because they have no ties to my world. I need someone who notices things. You noticed that man's weight was shifted to his left foot before he lunged. I saw you looking. Lena paused. She looked around the dingy diner at the flickering fluorescent lights, and then back at Donatello. Quadruple, she said. And I get Sundays off to read. Done, Donatello said. He had no idea that in the world of shadows, a background check that comes back completely, perfectly blank doesn't mean a person is innocent. It means their history was erased by people who topple governments. The transition was jarring, mostly for Donatello's men. When Lena arrived at the Rossi compound 2 days later, she was wearing an oversized thrift store suit that hung loosely on her frame. She carried a battered canvas tote bag, inside of which she kept a thermos of tea, a half-eaten sandwich, and 3 worn paperback romance novels. Silvio took one look at her and burst into laughter. Boss, Silvio gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. Tell me this is a joke. You brought a stray cat to a dogfight. She stays with me, Donatello ordered, brooking no argument. She drives the car. She stands by the door. You treat her with the same respect you treat me. For the first 2 months, Lena was practically invisible. She was the perfect ghost. She fetched Donatello's cigars, drove his armored sedan with a smooth, careful cadence, and stood quietly in the corners of smoky rooms while men in expensive suits threatened each other over shipping routes and territory. The men mocked her relentlessly, though always just out of Donatello's earshot. Hey, sweetheart, don't hurt yourself with that earpiece, a cartel enforcer sneered one afternoon. If things get loud, honey, just hide under the desk, another told her. Lena never reacted. She would simply blink her pale gray eyes, offer a polite, empty smile, and go back to reading her paperback. But Donatello, a man whose survival depended on noticing details, began to see the cracks in her civilian facade. It started with the spatial awareness. Lena never, under any circumstances, stood with her back to a window. When they entered a new room, her eyes would do a micro sweep. The doors, the air vents, the structural weak points, the sight lines. It took less than a second, but Donatello caught it. Then there was the driving. One evening, an aggressive truck began tailgating Donatello's sedan on the highway. Donatello's heart rate spiked, fearing a drive-by. Lena didn't panic. She didn't even accelerate. She smoothly downshifted, drifting the heavy armored car across 3 lanes of traffic with a terrifying, mathematically perfect grace, slipping onto an off-ramp right as a semi-truck blocked the tailgating vehicle. She did it all with one hand on the wheel, her face a mask of utter boredom. The final clue came during a sit-down at an upscale restaurant. A clumsy waiter dropped a tray of champagne flutes. The sound was deafening, mimicking the sharp crack of a gunshot. Every single one of Donatello's hardened killers flinched. Weapons were half drawn. Men ducked. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her hands didn't fly up in panic. Instead, she instantly shifted her weight, dropping her center of gravity, her eyes locking onto the 3 fastest exits in the room, her body positioning itself perfectly between the source of the noise and Donatello. It wasn't the reaction of someone who was scared. It was a reaction of a predator assessing a threat environment. Who are you, Lena? Donatello asked her in the car ride home that night. I'm your driver, Mr. Rossi, she said softly, turning a page of her book at a red light. The war with the Moretti family escalated from cold to boiling over the course of a week. The Morettis had discovered a weakness in Donatello's supply lines, information that could have only come from a mole. Millions of dollars in illicit goods were seized or destroyed. Desperate to stop the bleeding, Donatello agreed to a parley with Vincenzo Moretti. The location was set, an abandoned shipyard on the edge of the city docks, neutral ground, late on a Tuesday night. It's a trap, boss, Silvio argued in the estate's war room. Vincenzo doesn't negotiate when he's winning. We need to go in heavy. If we go in heavy, it means war. Donatello rubbed his temples. We take 10 men. Best of the best. We hear him out. He looked over at Lena, who was sitting on a leather sofa, sipping from a juice box. Lena, you drive. Silvio scoffed. You're taking a librarian to a cartel sit-down? She drives, Donatello repeated coldly. The night of the meeting, the sky opened up. A torrential downpour hammered the city, turning the docks into a slick, shadowed maze of towering shipping containers and rusting cranes. The armored sedan pulled into Warehouse 4. Silvio and 9 heavily armed Rossi enforcers fanned out, securing the perimeter. Donatello stepped out of the car. Lena followed, stepping into the shadows by a stack of wooden pallets, an oversized trench coat draped over her shoulders. The center of the warehouse was empty, save for a single folding table and a dim overhead light swinging in the wind. Vincenzo Moretti wasn't there. Where are they? Donatello muttered, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. Lena's head tilted slightly. Her eyes narrowed, staring into the dark rafters of the warehouse. Boss, she said, her voice dropping its usual bored tone, replacing it with something sharp and authoritative. Step back. What? Donatello asked. Step back. Now. She didn't wait for him to comply. Lena lunged forward, grabbing Donatello by the lapels of his suit and violently hauling him backward behind the engine block of a rusted forklift. A split second later, the space where Donatello had just been standing erupted into a storm of concrete dust and sparks. High-caliber sniper rounds rained down from the catwalks. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an extermination. The warehouse exploded into chaos. The Moretti family hadn't just brought hitters. They had hired professional, military-grade mercenaries. Men in tactical gear rappelled from the skylights. Floodlights snapped on, blinding Donatello's men. Ambush! Silvio roared, firing blindly into the rafters with his submachine gun before a burst of return fire tore through his chest, dropping the hulking enforcer to the concrete. The massacre was swift and brutal. Donatello's elite guards, the men who had mocked Lena for months, were outmaneuvered and gunned down in less than 60 seconds. They were street thugs fighting a tactical strike team. Donatello huddled behind the forklift, clutching his shoulder. A ricochet had caught him, tearing through his flesh. Blood soaked his white shirt. The gunfire slowed, replaced by the terrifying, methodical crunch of combat boots on glass as the mercenaries advanced to confirm the kills. Check the forklift, a voice barked in the darkness. The target is pinned. Donatello closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. This was it. He had survived 20 years in the Mafia, only to die in a rusted warehouse. He looked over at Lena, expecting to see her weeping, paralyzed by fear. She wasn't. Lena was calmly shrugging off her oversized, soaked trench coat. She reached up and pulled the pencil out of her hair, letting the dark locks fall before tying them back into a tight, practical knot. The boredom, the civilian clumsiness, the quiet meekness, it all melted off her face in an instant. What replaced it was a mask of cold, terrifying apex violence. From a concealed holster in the small of her back, one Donatello had never noticed in 3 months, she drew a custom, matte black tactical pistol. It had a threaded barrel, suppressor, and red dot sight. It was the weapon of a professional operator. "Stay down, boss," she whispered. Her voice was like ice. 3 mercenaries rounded the corner of the forklift, rifles raised. Lena moved. She didn't pop out and spray bullets like a gangster. She flowed like water. Shifting from cover, she engaged utilizing the center axis relook, car, system, keeping the pistol close to her chest. 2 suppressed shots. The first mercenary dropped, a bullet directly through the lens of his tactical goggles. The second mercenary's throat vanished in a spray of crimson before he could even squeeze his trigger. The third mercenary swung his rifle toward her. Lena didn't shoot him. She stepped inside the barrel of his rifle, grabbing the hot metal with her bare left hand, redirecting it upward as it fired harmlessly into the ceiling. In the same motion, she drove the base of her pistol into his temple, shattering his skull, before sweeping his legs and putting a final round through his chest as he fell. 3 elite killers dead. 3 seconds. Donatello stopped breathing. He was watching a ghost. Target is fighting back. "Converge!" A voice yelled across the warehouse. Lena didn't retreat. She advanced into the darkness. She became a phantom in the strobe light flashes of gunfire. Donatello watched in sheer, unadulterated awe and horror as his quiet, book-reading driver systematically dismantled a 30-man mercenary platoon. She didn't waste movement. Every step, every pivot was mathematically calculated. When her pistol clicked empty, she didn't panic. She dropped it, seamlessly drawing a combat knife from her boot, sliding under the blind spot of a heavy gunner, and severing his femoral artery before using his falling body as a meat shield against the next wave of fire. She stripped a rifle from a dead man, checked the chamber in a microsecond, and began clearing the room. It was a terrifying display of spatial dominance. She anticipated their flanking maneuvers before they made them. She shot through thin aluminum containers, knowing exactly where the men were hiding based on the sound of their boots. Silence descended on the warehouse. It was absolute. The heavy drumming of the rain on the tin roof was the only sound left. Lena walked back into the dim light of the forklift. Her white button-down shirt was completely spotless. Not a drop of blood on her. She picked up her dropped pistol, ejected the empty magazine, slammed a fresh one in, and holstered it. She looked down at Donatello, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, sterile trauma dressing, and knelt beside him. "Hold still. This will sting," she said, her voice returning to its normal, mild tone as she expertly packed his shoulder wound. "We need to leave, boss. The police monitor this sector, and 30 bodies are going to draw a crowd." Donatello swallowed hard. "Ooh, what are you?" Lena helped him to his feet. "I told you. I'm your driver." They didn't go back to the estate. Lena drove them to an off-the-books, safe house Donatello kept in the city limits. Once his wound was properly stitched by a syndicate doctor, Donatello bypassed his lieutenants entirely. He limped into the basement server room where Leo, his top cybersecurity expert, was monitoring the police scanners. "Leo," Donatello said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need you to run a search. Deep web, Interpol black files, the dark networks. Everything." Leo spun in his chair. "On who, boss?" "Lena." Leo frowned. "The waitress?" "Boss, I checked her when you brought her in. There's nothing. She doesn't exist before 5 years ago. No taxes, no birth certificate, no school records." "Exactly," Donatello said, pacing the room. "You looked in the light. Now look in the dark. Search for a female operator. Hand-to-hand specialist, extreme marksmanship, CAQB mastery. Look for unsolved syndicate wipes." Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard. He bypassed firewalls, diving into the encrypted global mercenary databases, places where governments bought and sold the names of ghosts. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Suddenly, Leo stopped typing. The color entirely drained from his face. He stared at the monitor, his mouth slightly open. "What is it?" Donatello demanded, stepping behind the chair. Leo slowly spun the laptop around. On the screen was a highly classified, heavily redacted intelligence file bearing the seal of 3 separate international intelligence agencies. Most of the text was blacked out, but the photograph in the corner was unmistakable. It was a younger Lena. Her eyes were just as cold. "Boss," Leo whispered, terrified to even speak the words aloud. "She isn't a bodyguard. She isn't a mercenary. Who is she? She's a myth. They call her the Wraith." Leo scrolled down, revealing a staggering, horrific list of confirmed operations. She was the apex predator of the assassin underworld. The file says she single-handedly dismantled the entire Romanov syndicate in Prague 6 years ago. Just walked into their fortress and killed 70 people. They say she's the one who took out the corrupt prime minister of... Leo stopped, gulping for air. "Boss, she's the boogeyman that other assassins check under their beds for." Donatello stared at the screen. "Where has she been?" "The file says she died 5 years ago in a blown op in Cairo." "Confirmed Kia." Leo looked up, trembling. "Boss, she faked her death. She took that diner job to retire. She just wanted to be invisible." Donatello felt a chill run down his spine. He had walked into a random diner and hired the most lethal human being on the planet to carry his cigars, and drive his car. And his men had spent 3 months mocking her. It was a miracle they were all still alive. "Boss," Leo squeaked. "She's upstairs." "What do we do?" Donatello straightened his jacket over his wounded shoulder. "I'm going to go talk to my driver." Donatello walked up the stairs to the safe house living room. Lena was sitting on a plush leather armchair. She had changed into a clean, oversized sweater. She was holding a juice box in one hand, and with the other, she was turning the page of a battered paperback copy of Pride and Prejudice. She didn't look up as Donatello entered, but he knew she heard him. He knew she had likely mapped out 3 different ways to kill him with the juice box draw if he made a sudden move. Donatello sat on the sofa opposite her. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. "The Wraith," Donatello finally said. Lena slowly closed her book. She placed it on the coffee table. She didn't look angry or surprised. She just looked incredibly tired. "I prefer Lena," she said softly. "The Wraith died in Cairo. It was a very loud, very messy death. I didn't care much for it. You killed 30 highly trained men tonight," Donatello said, his voice laced with absolute awe. "You moved like I've never seen anything like it. Why? Why take a job pouring coffee for $12 an hour?" "Because coffee is predictable," Lena said, leaning back. "Coffee doesn't shoot back. No one asks you to topple governments when you're wearing a pink diner uniform. I wanted quiet, Donatello. I wanted boring. And then I walked in. And then you walked in," Lena sighed, "with your cheap suits and your loud men. But you offer me Sundays off, and you let me read. So I figured I could babysit a local mob boss for a few years. Save up, buy a cabin in the woods." Donatello leaned forward. "If you wanted quiet, why did you save me tonight? You could have slipped away in the shadows. Let the Morettas kill me. Your cover would remain intact." Lena looked at him, her pale eyes piercing right through his soul. "Because you noticed I existed, Donatello. When your men treated me like a piece of furniture, you treated me like a person. And you pay on time." She stood up, walked to the kitchen, and threw her empty juice box into the recycling bin. "So what happens now?" Donatello asked, suddenly very aware that he was no longer in charge of this room. "You leave." Lena paused at the kitchen counter. She looked out the window at the rising sun over the city. "Your mole," Lena said, changing the subject entirely. "It was Silvio. He tipped off the Morettas about your supply lines. He orchestrated the ambush tonight. He was supposed to fall back as soon as the shooting started, but he was too slow. That's why he caught a bullet early." Donatello blinked, the betrayal washing over him, followed immediately by the realization of her tactical genius. "You knew. I knew 3 weeks ago. I checked his bank accounts and his encrypted phone. He was sloppy." Donatello let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The mole was dead. The immediate threat was neutralized. But a new, much more terrifying reality had set in. "Vincenzo Moretti will retaliate for tonight," Donatello said. "He lost a fortune in mercenaries. He'll come for my head." Lena turned around. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. The tired, bored librarian looked faded just a fraction, revealing the apex predator lurking just beneath the skin. "Vincenzo Moretti is a problem," Lena agreed. "But I don't like my reading time being interrupted by gunfire. It throws off my concentration." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, Mr. Rossi, that your contract with me was for a bodyguard. The threat has escalated beyond simple defense. If you want me to resolve the Moretti problem, it requires a renegotiation of my contract." Donatello swallowed. "What are your terms?" 10 times my current salary, paid into an offshore, untraceable account. A new identity forged by your top guy. And I want weekends off. And in exchange, Lena offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a tiger looking at a wounded gazelle. "In exchange, Vincenzo Moretti won't be a problem by Thursday morning. And the rest of the families in this city will learn exactly what happens when they interrupt my quiet time." Donatello Rossi, head of the most powerful syndicate in the city, realized he was no longer the most dangerous person in his own mafia. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his expensive gold pen, and smiled back.